The war had lasted 3 years, 3 long, terrible years that left scars on every human world that had been touched by it. Cities on the outer colonies still had broken walls, families still had empty chairs at their dinner tables, and the soldiers who had come home, the ones lucky enough to come home, carried something heavy behind their eyes that never fully went away. The Valari had started it. They were an old species, older than humanity by thousands of years, tall but silver blue skinned, with 4 amber eyes, and a culture built entirely around strength, dominance, and conquest. They had rolled through dozens of species before they reached humanity's corner of the galaxy. Most of those species had surrendered within months. Some had surrendered within weeks. The Vithari High Council had looked at the small, fragile, short-lived humans and expected the same. They did not get the same. Humanity had fought, not cleanly, not perfectly, and then not without devastating losses, but they had fought with a stubbornness that the Valari simply had no frame of reference for. Human commanders had retreated, adapted, regrouped, and come back. Human engineers had reverse engineered, captured Valari weapons mid-war, and deployed countermeasures before the enemy even realized what was happening. Human soldiers had held positions that should have broken in hours for days, sometimes weeks, running on almost nothing. After 3 years, but the Vithari High Council did something they had never done in their long history of expansion. They asked for a ceasefire. It did not feel like a victory to the humans. Too many people were gone for it to feel like anything clean, but it was, in its own quiet way, something remarkable. Humanity had been the first species to make the Valari blink. The ceasefire was followed by months of tense negotiation aboard a neutral station in deep space. There were arguments, there were walkouts, but there were long silences over conference tables that felt like they could collapse into violence at any moment. But slowly, carefully, a framework for peace began to take shape. And then the Valari put something unexpected on the table, a political marriage. It was an old tradition in Valari culture, older than their space program, older than their empire. When two powers reached the end of conflict, the strongest available bond was a union between bloodlines. It was not romantic, and it was not meant to be. It was a lock on a door. It said to every faction on both sides, this peace is real and it has a face. The Valari's chosen representative was announced almost immediately. Princess Saraya Velvian, eldest daughter of Grand Warlord Vayan Velser, commander of the 3rd Valari battle fleet, decorated in 4 campaigns. She was by any measure one of the most formidable individuals in the Dominion. Choosing her was a statement. Za told humanity that the Valari were taking this seriously. Earth's diplomatic council stared at each other across a conference room for a long time after that announcement. They needed someone, not a politician. The Vithari would see through that, not a figurehead. That would be an insult to a princess who had won real battles. They needed someone with military credibility, someone who could stand next to a Valari warrior princess without looking like a decorative accessory. Oh, and someone who would not crack under the pressure of living inside an alien empire as its most politically visible human. It was a counselor named Diane Ward who first pulled up the file on Cole Harrove. He was 34, a lieutenant commander in the Earth Fleet currently, assigned to a patrol route on the outer edge of the former conflict zone. His service record was not the kind that got people noticed at ceremonies. There were no single moments of explosive heroism in it. What it did contain page after page was a pattern. Cole Harrove had been in 6 situations during the war where the survival odds had been extremely poor, and in every single one of them he had found a way to bring his crew back, not through luck, through patience, through thinking under pressure, and through a particular quality that was hard to name but easy to recognize. The man simply did not panic, not in any recorded instance, not ever. His crew had been interviewed after the war and as part of standard debriefs. When asked about their commanding officer, almost all of them had said some version of the same thing. He was calm. Whatever happened, he was calm. And that made us feel like it was going to be okay. Diane Ward circled his name. The rest of the council took some convincing. He was not the most decorated. He was not the most famous. He was not the most physically imposing, which mattered at least symbolically when standing next to a Villari. And but Ward made the argument carefully and completely, and in the end, the others came around. Cole was summoned to Earth on a standard transport. He was not told why until he was sitting in a council chamber with 8 people looking at him across a wide table. They explained the situation in full: the war, the treaty framework, the marriage proposal, the need for a candidate, the fact that they had chosen him. Cole sat quietly through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not look alarmed. When they finished, he was still for a moment, looking at the table in front of him with a thoughtful expression, the way a man looks when he is turning something over in his mind, carefully before responding. Then he said, "I'll do it." The council exchanged small glances of relief. Cole looked up. "I have one question." Of course, Ward said. "Do I have permission to be honest with her?" "Not diplomatic, honest." The room went a little quiet. It was not the question they had expected, and several of them looked uncertain, as though they were trying to figure out whether honesty with an alien princess was a strategic asset or a liability. Ward studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." Cole nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't look excited or nervous or proud. He looked like a man who had just been handed a difficult job and was already thinking about how to do it right. He was given 3 weeks to put his affairs in order before the formal introduction process with the Vithari delegation would begin. On the last evening before he left his quarters for the final time, his younger brother Pete called him over a calm line and asked him if he was scared. Cole thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things. "Not yet," he said. Pete laughed a little, the way you laugh when something is both funny and sad at the same time. "You know," Pete said, I think that might actually be exactly why they picked you." Cole didn't answer that. He just said good night, closed the comm, and looked out the small window of his quarters at the stars for a while. Somewhere out there, beyond the patrol routes and the debris fields of the war, was a Vallari flagship carrying a princess who thought this arrangement was nothing more than a political tool. Cole had dealt with harder problems than being underestimated, and he turned off the light and went asleep. The neutral station above Tethys 4 was not a beautiful place. It was a working station, all gray metal corridors, recycled air, and the low hum of environmental systems running around the clock. It had been chosen precisely because it belonged to no one, no flags on the walls, no symbols of either side. Just a place in the middle of empty space where two very different peoples could stand on equal ground. The Valari delegation arrived first, and 3 warships dropped out of faster than light travel in tight formation, the way soldiers walk into a room, deliberate, unhurried, making sure everyone noticed. Their shuttle docked at the primary bay with a precision that was almost theatrical. When the doors opened, Saraya Velvin walked out ahead of her entire escort, and the human station crew standing nearby went very still without meaning. She was tall, nearly 2 m, with the lean and dense build of someone who had spent a lifetime training for war. Her skin was the silver blue of the Vithari, smooth and cool looking, marked along her jaw and collarbone with dark war glyphs that had been earned, not given. She wore ceremonial armor, not decorative armor, the kind worn for show, but actual combat-grade plating that had simply been polished for the occasion. Her 4 amber eyes moved across the room in a single sweep, cataloging everything in seconds. And she did not look like someone who was here for a wedding. She looked like someone who had agreed to sign a contract and intended to get it over with. Cole arrived on a smaller human transport 30 minutes later. He walked off the ramp in his dress uniform, dark navy, clean lines, a handful of service ribbons over his left chest that anyone paying attention would recognize as significant. He was not as tall as the Volturi, not as visually imposing. He had brown hair, a straightforward face, and the kind of steady eyes that did not dart around a room. When he saw Saraya across the docking bay, he looked at her for a moment, not staring, not performing confidence, just looking the way you look at something you are genuinely trying to understand. Then he walked over and introduced himself. He said his name. He said he was glad the station had good air recycling because deep space transports were always a little stale, and he said it without any apparent awareness that it was an unusual thing to say to a Velari princess in front of both delegations. Saraya stared at him. Her translator unit rendered his words into theory tongue a half-second after he spoke. Then she processed what he had said. Then she looked at him with an expression that could only be described as deeply, carefully neutral, the expression of someone choosing not to react to something because reacting would require acknowledging that it had happened. Lieutenant Commander Hargrove, she said through the translator. Her voice was low and even. I have been briefed on the ceremony arrangements. Cole is fine, he said. Another pause. Very well, she said, and that was the end of their first conversation. The ceremony itself was held in the station's largest common room, which had been transformed with considerable effort by both delegations. Half the space carried Valari ceremonial colors, deep crimson and black, with tall structural pieces that held burning ceremonial compounds that produced a cool, smokeless flame. The other half held human elements, white linens, warm light, and flowers that had been shipped in from a colony 2 systems away, because someone in the diplomatic office had decided that flowers were important. The two halves did not blend together particularly well. They sat next to each other like two people on a bench who did not know each other and were both looking straight ahead. The ceremony was conducted by a jointly appointed, efficient, and elderly human diplomat named Roger Cass, who had spent 40 years in interstellar relations and had a practiced ability to speak for long periods of time in a way that sounded meaningful without saying anything that either side could object to. He did his job well. Saraya stood through the ritual portions with perfect stillness. Cole stood beside her with his hands clasped loosely in front of him and said his parts at the right moments in a calm, clear voice. When the final binding declaration was spoken and the formal union was registered in both civilizations' legal records, Sarah looked at him briefly. He looked back at her. Neither of them smiled. It was not that kind of moment. The reception afterward was where things got interesting. The Vithari nobles moved in small clusters, speaking their own language, watching the humans with a mixture of curiosity and the particular flavor of condescension that the Vithari had perfected over centuries of considering themselves the dominant species in every room they entered. They approached Saraya in turns to offer what were in human terms consolation. Speeches, quiet murmurs in Vithari that assumed the small human beside her understood nothing. Cole understood more. Then he led on. His Vari was not fluent. Not yet, but he had spent the 3 weeks between his briefing and the ceremony with language files running every spare hour, and he had a good ear. He picked up enough words like diminished and without markings, and temporary arrangement featured more than once each time as something in the line of his jaw tightened slightly, not enough to make a scene, just enough to register. Saraya noticed on the third exchange. She had been watching him from the corner of her secondary eyes, a veil Thar habit using the outer eye pair for peripheral surveillance, and she saw the jaw. She did not say anything about it, but she filed it away. The young human diplomat Lily Akafer stayed close to the edges of the reception, watching Cole with the careful attention of someone who knew things that were not in the public briefing. She was 29, precise and competent, and she had read Cole's full file, not the version given to the Vithari, but the complete one. There were sections of it that were still classified. She knew what was in those sections. She hoped quietly and sincerely that nothing would ever make them relevant at the end of the night, or when the delegations had retreated to their respective temporary quarters and the station's lights had dimmed to night cycle settings. Cole stood alone for a few minutes on a small observation deck, looking at the stars. Saraya walked past in the corridor behind the deck's viewport. She stopped when she saw him standing there. She looked at him through the glass, this quiet, unremarkable human man standing alone in the dark with his hands in his pockets, looking at space as though it was something ordinary. She watched him for a moment, then she walked on. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a political arrangement, a name on a document, a face on a press release that would be circulated to reassure both populations that the peace was real. But she thought about the jaw again, the way it had tightened and then stilled, the control in it. She had seen plenty of people pretend not to be insulted. This had not looked like pretending, and it had looked like someone who had made a decision not to react and was sticking to it purely because reacting was not useful yet. Saraya did not know what to do with that. She went to her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark for a while, then she opened a military report to read, because that was Something she understood. The Valthari flagship was called the Eternal Dominion. It was enormous. Nearly 4 km long, built in the angular. There's aggressive style that the Valari applied to everything they made. Sharp edges, heavy armor, weapon systems. Visible on the hull like muscles on a body, it did not look like a ship that had ever been designed with comfort in mind. It looked like a ship that had been designed to make other ships feel afraid. Cole stepped aboard it and looked around with the same expression he used for most things, calm, observant, quietly taking everything in. His quarters were small by human standards and clearly not designed with human proportions in mind. The bunk was too wide and too short. The lighting ran cooler and bluer than humans preferred. The door controls were set at Valari shoulder height, which meant Cole had to reach up slightly. Every time he used them, none of this seemed to bother him particularly. He adjusted his sleep position, ignored the lighting, and reached for the door controls without complaint. The Sarah had expected friction. She had assumed the human would come to her within the first week asking for accommodations, adjustments, special food, something almost every non-Valthari who had ever lived aboard the Eternal Dominion had asked for something within the first few days. It was practically a tradition among the crew, taking bets on what the newcomer would request first. Cole did not request anything. He showed up to the morning mess on the second day, or looked at the Valthari food, which was dense, strongly flavored, and formulated for a species with a very different digestive system, and ate it without visible drama. He did not finish everything on his plate, but he ate enough that no one could call it refusal. When a junior crew member watched him eat with open curiosity and then asked through a translator what he thought of the food, Cole considered it for a moment and said it reminded him of something his uncle used to cook, or except with more minerals. The crew members stared at him, then walked away, unsure what to do with that answer. Within 2 weeks, Cole had learned that mess hall seating customs, which sections belonged to which ranks, which seats were considered neutral, and which ones carried quiet political meaning among the crew. He never sat in the wrong place twice. The crew noticed this. They did not say anything about it openly, but they noticed. He trained every morning in the fitness bay. Aveller training was built for their physiology. Heavy resistance, explosive movement, drills designed around their natural strength advantages. Cole did not attempt to match them. Instead, he ran long, steady, rhythmic running that the Valari found both baffling and mildly hypnotic to watch. He also did floor exercises, push-ups, body weight movements, and controlled breathing routines with a patience and repetition that made a few of the crew stop and observe from the doorway without quite meaning to. One older crew member, a weapons technician named Bev R., commented to a colleague that the human trained like someone preparing for something long rather than something fast. His colleague did not know what to make of that. Saraya watched Cole from a distance during these weeks, but she told herself it was political monitoring, standard practice when a foreign national was living aboard her ship. This was true, but not entirely honest, and she was self-aware enough to know it. What she was actually doing was trying to find the shape of him, trying to understand what kind of person this was. In Valthari culture, you read someone through their reactions, what made them angry, what made them show off, What made them back down? Ackle was frustratingly difficult to read by those methods because he seemed to react to almost nothing in the expected ways. She tested him directly a few times, blunt, pointed comments about human limitations, about the war, about the terms of the treaty. He answered her honestly every time, without defensiveness and without aggression. Once, when she told him that most species found living among theory to be overwhelming, and he told her that most things were manageable once you stopped waiting for them to feel comfortable. She had not had a response to that ready, which annoyed her. The situation changed on a Tuesday afternoon, though the Veil Thar did not mark time in Tuesdays, when a junior officer named Keth decided to do something about the human. Keith Var was young, ambitious, and deeply unhappy about the peace treaty. He had lost family in the war. He viewed the marriage arrangement as a humiliation, dressed up in diplomatic language, and he viewed Cole specifically as a symbol of everything he resented about it. He had been watching Cole for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He found it in the main corridor outside the training bay, in front of a crowd of off-duty crew members. He stepped in front of Cole and issued a formal dominance challenge. His voice was loud enough to carry. The corridor went quiet. Immediately, heads turned. Crew members drifted in from adjoining passages, the way people always drift toward the thing they can sense is about to happen. In Vithari culture, a formal dominance challenge in front of witnesses carried real social weight. Refusing it was possible, but it marked the refuser as beneath consideration, not a political figure, not a partner, not anything worth respecting. Accepting it and losing was still better than refusing, because at least you had shown the willingness to stand. Eyal looked at Kethvar for a moment, then he looked at the gathered crew around them, then he looked at Kethvar again and said in slow but recognizable Valathari that he accepted. The corridor got very quiet. Saraya, who had been informed within 40 seconds by her second-in-command, arrived at the edge of the crowd just as the space was being cleared. She stood with her arms folded, her face composed, and her mind running rapid calculations about how badly this was going to go and how much damage she could contain afterward. What she watched over the next 15 minutes was not what she had calculated. Cole did not try to overpower Keithvar. He was not stupid. Keithvar had 30 kg on him and a skeleton built for impact. Any direct exchange of force was a losing trade, and Cole clearly knew it. Instead, he moved, he circled, redirected, slipped angles. High-end forced Kthvar to keep adjusting. When Kethvar's strikes landed, and some of them did land, Cole absorbed them with a kind of grim, deliberate endurance and kept moving. He did not go down. Each time the crew expected him to drop, he simply reset his footing and came back. He tired Keithvar out steadily, methodically. Over 15 grinding minutes, he reduced the younger Valathari's explosive advantage to nothing by simply refusing to stop. When Kthvar's form finally broke apart from exhaustion, Cole moved in with clean economy and locked him into a hold that Kthvar could not break from. Kethvar went still, then he submitted. Cole released him immediately and held out a hand. Keithvar stared at it, the human gesture of help, unfamiliar and strange in this context. After a long moment, he took it and Cole pulled him To his feet, the crew did not cheer. They did something quieter and stranger. Now they simply stood and looked at Cole with an expression that had not been there before. Saraya stood among them, arms still folded, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She looked at Cole. He caught her eye across the corridor. He did not look triumphant. He did not look like a man who had just proven something. He looked the same as always, steady, calm, a little tired. She held his gaze for one long moment, and then she turned and walked back to the command deck without a word. But that night, for the first time since the ceremony, she did not open a military report before going to sleep. The neutral station above Tethys 4 was never meant to be a military target. It had no weapons, it had no Combatra shielding. It was a diplomatic post, a place for meetings, for document transfers, for slow and careful conversations between people who were still learning to trust each other. Lily Ophir had been stationed there for 2 months, managing the human diplomatic office that was still working through the finer details of the peace framework. It was quiet work, important, but quiet. The attack came on a morning when Cole happened to be there for a routine communications review. He had taken a short transport from the Eternal Dominion 2 days earlier, cleared through both sides' security channels, and was sitting in the station's communications hub going through a backlog of encrypted liaison reports when the lights in the corridor outside shifted from white to red and the emergency klaxon ran one short burst, then cut off completely. Cut klaxon was worse than a running one. It meant someone had taken the alarm system offline on purpose. Cole sat down his data pad. He was very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood up and moved to the door and looked out into the corridor, and what he saw told him most of what he needed to know. 2 Vithari soldiers in non-standard armor, no Dominion markings, no fleet insignia, were moving fast down the far end of the passage. The armor was real. The weapons were real, but the lack of markings meant they were not here officially, which meant no one was coming to stop them except whatever was already on the station. Cole went back into the communications hub, locked the door from the inside, and spent 90 seconds doing 3 things at the same time. He sent a compressed emergency signal on the fleet frequency, short, clean, with the station's coordinates and the words hostile borders, unmarked violari, diplomatic staff at risk. He pulled up the station's maintenance schematic on the secondary terminal, the one that showed every corridor, every vent line, every power relay and pressure door in the building, and Andy opened the small equipment locker in the corner of the room that held the standard issue sidearm that every human diplomatic outpost was required by regulation to keep on site. He checked the charge. It was full. He clipped it to his side and looked at the schematic for another 30 seconds, memorizing the layout the way he had always memorized things, not trying to hold every detail, just trying to understand the shape of it, where the choke points were, where the power ran, or where a person could move without being seen. Then he unlocked the door and went into the corridor. What was happening on the station had been organized carefully. The splinter faction Vithari lords who had opposed the peace treaty from the moment it was proposed had sent a full company of shock troops. Their goal was specific: kill the human diplomatic staff, destroy the records of the treaty framework. make it look like an accident or an internal malfunction, and without the human architects of the agreement, without the documentation, the peace would have nothing to stand on. It would collapse, and the war, they believed, could begin again on terms more favorable to their faction. They had not planned for Cole Hargrove. They had known he was on the station. They had considered him a low-level complication, one human soldier with a sidearm against a full company of Valari shock troops. Their tactical estimate had assigned him approximately 4 minutes before he was neutralized. What they got instead was 40 minutes of something that none of their analysts had a category for. Cole did not fight them directly. He was not foolish enough to walk into corridors full of Valari soldiers and trade shots. Instead, he used the station the way he had used everything else in his life, carefully, patiently, and with a clear understanding of what he actually had available to him. He used the maintenance tunnels, the station's ventilation and service corridors ran parallel to the main passages, accessible through small hatches that the Valthari soldiers were not monitoring because soldiers of their size could not fit through them. Cole could. He moved through the station's hidden skeleton, crawling where he had to, moving fast where he could, and he attacked not the soldiers themselves, but the environment around them. He rerouted power to specific corridor sections, triggering magnetic lock overrides that sealed squads away from each other, cutting the company's coordination in half. He found the environmental control node for the station's lower level and adjusted the atmospheric pressure in 2 of the main corridors just enough to cause disorientation without permanent harm. The Valari physiology was sensitive to pressure shifts in ways that human engineers had documented. During the war, Thanky pulled a service panel from a power relay junction and used the exposed cabling to shut down the lighting in the station's central hub entirely, dropping the shock troops' most concentrated grouping into complete darkness. Valthari eyes were adapted for low light, but they were not adapted for the sudden total loss of it. There was a difference between dim and black. He picked off isolated soldiers at the edges of the formation, not with the sidearm which would give away his position, as but with station tools, a pressure seal deployed into a corridor doorway, a maintenance cart sent rolling down a passage with its emergency brake disabled, a fire suppression system triggered in a confined space at the precise moment 2 soldiers were moving through it. He took damage. It was unavoidable. A soldier caught a glimpse of him in a maintenance junction and got a strike in before Cole cleared the hatch. Something cracked in his left forearm, and he wrapped it with a torn piece of his jacket sleeve, tightened it with his teeth, and kept moving. A second hit came from a ricochet in a narrow passage, a burn across his left side that he became aware of in the distant, managed way that people who have trained themselves to function under pain become aware of. Things. He noted it. He kept moving. By the time Saraya's forces breached the outer hull, 26 minutes after his emergency signal, in which was extraordinarily fast response time for a fleet at transit distance, the Valthari shock troops had been separated into isolated groups, disoriented and largely contained in sections of the station that had been locked down by the infrastructure around them. They were not all neutralized, but they were no longer a coordinated threat. Lily Akafer and the remaining diplomatic staff were In the station's records room on the upper level behind a barricade that Cole had helped set up and seal in the first 4 minutes before he went back into the tunnels. They were shaken, they were unheard. Saraya came through the breach herself. She did not wait for her security detail to clear the path first. She moved fast and with purpose through the smoke-hazed corridors, following her soldiers toward the last reported position of the signal source. She found Cole sitting on the floor of a corridor junction. His back was against the wall. On his left arm had a makeshift wrap. Around it, there was a burn mark along his left side that had gone through the jacket. His face was pale with the specific pour of someone running on adrenaline that was starting to wear off, but his breathing was steady and his eyes were clear. And when Saraya came around the corner and stopped in front of him, he looked up at her with the same expression he always had, calm, present, a little tired. The corridor around him was filled with her soldiers, or they had come in hard and fast, ready for a firefight, and instead they had found this, a station that had already been half dismantled from the inside, and one human sitting quietly in the middle of it. Nobody spoke. One of Sarah's senior commanders, a veteran named Dren Val, who had fought in 3 campaigns and had not shown visible surprise at anything in over a decade, raised his right fist slowly to his chest. The old gesture, the one given only in genuine recognition, and then the soldier beside him did the same, then another, then the rest of them, one by one, standing in a damaged corridor in the half-light, fists to their chests, looking at a human with a wrapped arm and a burn on his jacket. Saraya stepped forward through her soldiers. She stopped directly in front of Cole and looked down at him. He looked up at her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. She reached down and placed her hand on his shoulder, not gently to not softly, but with the full deliberate weight of a Valari warrior acknowledging something real. Cole held her gaze. He did not look away, and the fleet, watching the live feed on the military channel that the Splinter faction had accidentally left open when they launched the attack, watched all of it, every ship in range, every commander, every crew member who happened to be near a screen. They watched Saraya Velvian, princess of the Dominion, daughter of the Grand Warlord, the decorated commander of the 3rd Battle Fleet, place her hand on a human's shoulder in a broken corridor and mean it completely. No one who saw it had a word for what they felt, but every single one of them felt it. The medical bay on the Eternal Dominion was not designed for human patients. Beds were too large. The diagnostic tools read Valari biology and returned confused data when pressed against Cole's skin. The attending physician, a tall, thin Valari nameservant who had spent 30 years treating soldiers, stood over Cole with an expression of professional frustration and ran his scanner a 3rd time, hoping for a different result. He did not get one. Cole, sitting on the edge of the oversized bed with his jacket off and his left arm extended, watched the physician work with patient cooperation. The forearm had a clean fracture, painful but not complicated. The burn on his left side was surface level. They already treated and sealed with a compound that Saraya's medics had assured him worked on most carbon-based tissue. He had taken the compound's effects on Faith, which said something about how far things had come in 3 months. Saran finished his assessment, set down the scanner and looked at Cole. With a long, unreadable look, then he said in slow and deliberate Thari that the fracture would take 3 weeks, and that Cole was to avoid using the arm for anything strenuous. Nicole thanked him in Velari. Sarin picked up his scanner and left the bay without another word, but at the door he paused for just a moment, not long enough to be obvious, and then walked on. Sarah came to the medical bay an hour later. She stood in the doorway and looked at Cole, who was sitting up, reading something on a data pad with his good arm. He looked up when she came in. She walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down, which surprised him slightly. Saria rarely sat in the presence of others unless she was at a command table. They did not talk about what had happened on the station right away. She asked about the arm. He told her what the physician had said. She told him that the Splinter faction's leadership had already been identified, and that the Dominion's own military forces were moving on them. He nodded. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Then she said quietly, that she had watched the feed. He said he figured she had. She said, though, Fleet had watched it too. He did not say anything to that. She looked at him for a moment, all 4 eyes which she rarely directed at him fully and directly. Why did you not tell me? She said. What was in your file? The parts they did not share with us. Cole thought about that for a second. Because it wasn't relevant until it was, he said. And because you wouldn't have believed it if I told you. Yeah. People don't usually believe that kind of thing until they see it. Saria was quiet, then in a voice that was still, even but carried something underneath it that had not been there before. She said that she had underestimated him. Cole looked at her. I know, he said. It's okay. Most people do. I will not do it again, she said. It was not an apology. Saria Velvian did not apologize. It was not a Thari custom, and it was not in her personal vocabulary, but it was something more direct than an apology. It was a statement of change, a line drawn. Cole understood the difference, and he respected it. Good, he said, and that was the end of that conversation. The political aftermath of the attack took months to work through. The Splinter faction was dismantled piece by piece, its assets frozen, its members brought before the Dominion's High Council. The proceedings were public, which was unusual and deliberate. In the Grand Warlord and Saria's father wanted every corner of the Dominion to see clearly that the peace was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a position of strength, and challenging it had consequences. The peace treaty, which had been fragile in the weeks following the ceremony, was now harder than it had been before. The attempted assassination had done the opposite of what the Splinter faction intended. Rather than unraveling the agreement, and it had given both sides something to point to, a shared enemy, a shared crisis survived, and a shared moment that everyone had seen on the feed and could not unsee. Several Valthari lords who had previously sat in careful non-committal silence now added their formal support to the treaty, not out of sentiment, out of calculation. They had watched the feed, they had seen what Sarah did in that corridor, and then they had made the reasonable assessment that a political alliance that produced that kind of loyalty on both sides was an alliance worth protecting. On the human side, the news of what had happened at Tethys 4 moved quickly. Cole's name became known in a way that his service record never had made it known. not as a decorated commander or a public figure, but as a specific story that people passed between themselves. The quiet man who held a station alone for 40 minutes, the one who helped the enemy soldier up after beating him, the one that Saraya had acknowledged in front of the whole fleet. Pete called Cole as soon as the news reached Earth. The comm connected, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Pete said, "So 40 minutes. About that," Cole said, "in a broken arm, it's a fracture smaller than a break." Pete laughed, the same laugh as before, both funny and something else at the same time. "Are you okay?" he asked. And then this time the question was simple and direct. "Yeah," Cole said. "I'm okay." There was a pause. "Is she treating you well?" Pete asked. Cole looked across the room at the corridor, beyond the open doorway where the sound of the flagship's daily operations moved at its usual pace. Crew voices in Valerie, the low hum of the ship systems, the distant clang of something in the engineering section that always happened at this hour for reasons no one had explained to him yet, or better than she did before. He said, "Lily recovered at a human medical post 2 systems away and sent Cole a short message when she was cleared." It read, "I told you they'd figure it out eventually. Also, you owe me for not mentioning the classified sections of your file when I was briefing the Valerie. I had to sit on that the entire time." Cole read it and allowed himself a small, quiet smile. He sent back 2 words, "Thank you." He meant them for more reasons than she probably realized. 3 weeks after the attack, a new Valerie ambassador arrived aboard the Eternal Dominion. He had been sent by a powerful Eastern faction of the Dominion that wanted to revisit several points in the treaty framework, not to break it but to negotiate for more favorable terms on resource access and border definitions. It was a standard political move, and the kind that happened after major crises, when parties tried to shift ground while the dust was still settling. The ambassador was experienced and well prepared. He had spent 2 weeks reading briefings, studying the treaty, and preparing arguments for each point he intended to challenge. He walked into the Joint Council chamber with a measured confidence, the way someone walks into a room when they believe they have the advantage. Cole and Sarah were already seated when he entered. They were side by side at the head of the table, not performing anything, not arranged for effect, just sitting the way 2 people sit when they are used to sitting beside each other, quietly with the ease of familiarity, both looking at the door as he came in with expressions of identical polite patience. The ambassador stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at them, both of them, together, and then he thought about the feed, about 40 minutes in a damaged station, about a fleet standing silent with fists to their chests, about Saraya Velvian's hand on a human's shoulder, and what that gesture meant in Velthari culture, and what it said about the person she had placed it on. He sat down across the table, folded his hands in front of him, and quietly revised every position he had prepared before he opened his mouth to speak. He did not challenge the core terms. He asked instead about the border survey process, a reasonable technical question, and the conversation that followed was professional, constructive, and concluded in under 2 hours. When he left, he told his aide that he had revised his approach because the situation had looked different in person than it had in the briefing documents. His aide asked what specifically had looked different, the ambassador thought about it for a moment, then he said, simply, and did not elaborate further. Cole and Saraya walked back from the council chamber together in the quiet of the corridor. Neither of them spoke. Ship hummed around them, somewhere in the engineering section. The same unexplained clang happened at its usual hour. Saraya glanced at him as they walked. He glanced back. No words, none were needed.